Good morning. COVID-19 delivered the biggest jolt to American education in its history, and it set back learning opportunities for children all around the United States. More than 3 years after the pandemic began, we're still seeing the aftershocks, profoundly weakened academic results, soaring rates of student absenteeism, and worsening mental health outcomes might be the most concerning of all. And to make matters worse, those harms have been visited disproportionately on our most disadvantaged students. Over the next 40 minutes, we'll be discussing the potential for bridging skills and learning gaps and exploring innovations that can help all students, but especially our most underserved. I'm Kevin Mahnken. I'm a senior writer for the 74, and today I'm joined by a terrific roster of guests. AJ Gutierrez is the co-founder and chief policy and public affairs officer for Saga Education, which is a national leader in high-impact in-school tutoring. Corey Morrison is the director of mathematics for Chicago Public Schools, where he leads the math office within the Department of STEM. He previously served as a math teacher, department chair, and most recently, the assistant principal of Kenwood Academy. Thomas Toch is an education policy expert at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, and he is the founding director of FutureEd, an independent, solution-oriented think tank at McCourt. And that is just the top of an enormously lengthy bio for Tom. Sorry for abbreviating too much, but we don't want to go on all day. Tailheem Wentt offers a great student voice today. He completed an IT workforce development program with Preschool, which paved the way to his position today as a help desk specialist at 2U. Very excitingly, he recently took part in Roadtrip Nation, and he was selected to be featured on Roadtrip Nation's To Be Determined docuseries. Particularly, he has a really incredible personal story to share, and I'm hoping we get into that story today. So I want to begin now with a couple of questions, and I think, Tom, we're going to start with you. So if you want to go deeper into that bio, you certainly can. FutureEd has been tracking the state of schools post-COVID. And at FutureEd, you have a great index of data points front and center on the site. And one in particular stood out to me. 16 million students were chronically absent in spring 2022. And I believe that's on top of, I think it was 10 million students, roughly 1 in 5, in 2020 to 2021. So it's a huge problem. It's a growing problem. So it's easy to talk about the impact of the pandemic in broad strokes. But here in 2023, I'm hoping you can help us understand how and where students are feeling the ramifications of this chronic absenteeism problem.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kevin. And thanks for hosting the event. It's an important conversation to have at a critical time in the evolution of public education in the country. As you say, the absenteeism problem is really severe. It was severe before the pandemic, but it has become more problematic with the dislocations and traumas impacting families and students during the pandemic. And we really haven't solved that problem yet. In a few states, the numbers have grown just dramatically. So Connecticut, for example, reports that the proportion of chronically absent students in the state rose from 12% in 18-19 to 25% in 21-22. California, the numbers rose from 13% to 30%. So when you have that kind of chronic absenteeism, meaning that students are missing at least 10% of the school year, you're really diminishing the productivity of schools, much less making it very difficult to catch students up. And it is, as you say, the students living in poverty, those with disabilities, those from communities of color who are needing as much support and as much additional schooling as they could get pre-pandemic, who are among those who are missing even more school now post-pandemic. So it is a real problem. You can't learn if you're not in school, and we have way too many kids who are not in school.
It seems like an enormously geographically diverse problem. Some states, some districts are doing a little better than others, although I don't think anyone is where they want to be. Are there individual districts or states perhaps that devise strategies around attracting students and engaging with students and families to bring them back into school on a more consistent basis?
Sure. Well, there are districts all over the country that are working hard to address the problem, and some states, Connecticut would be one, that have done a number of things, positive things, things that research suggests makes a difference, including reaching out to families with staff that they've hired with the federal pandemic relief monies to build personal connections to students and families, to find them in some instances in the wake of the pandemic, and to help address the many challenges that those families are facing that get in the way of their students attending school. There are incentive programs that are emerging around the country. There are efforts to build more connections between students and adults in schools. So there's actually a range of strategies that can be that can make a difference, and we actually outlined a number of those in a recent report we did, something we call an attendance playbook. But that's the encouraging news, right? But the challenge is to get these ideas out to the many local school leaders and education practitioners whose job it is to connect schools. I mean, we are public education in this country, as you well know, is a vast decentralized system. So you can't flip a switch and have everybody do the right thing all across the country. Far from it. You've got to inform and then the judgment of tens of thousands of local policymakers and decision makers, and then encourage them to act once you've given them strategies to address absenteeism and any number of other reforms. So the work is really challenging, but there are strategies, and quite a few of them research has suggested to us that can make a difference.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think we're all concerned about the threshold at which an absent student becomes a chronically absent student, becomes a missing student. And I think a lot of folks in central offices in a lot of districts like you, Corey, are keeping an eye on that as well. I was hoping I could talk to you, Corey, about your work at the math department at Chicago Public Schools. So this is a district I reported on recent results from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the nation's report card. Chicago saw some of the steepest math declines anywhere in the country on the 2022 version of NAEP, which is the first since the pandemic. It's important to note. I believe the declines in 8th grade were something like 12 points, which is, I believe, the second worst of any of the major districts measured. That's got to be concerning you. I'm wondering how you and your team are supporting students right now around math and reducing barriers to their success in that subject.
Yeah, thanks for having me to speak on that. I think it's really important to what Thomas said, that attendance is a major issue, and we've identified that has been a problem for students during the pandemic with the online learning and things like that. I think it's important to note that math scores were on the rise for CPS for a long time prior to the pandemic, so it really reversed a lot of the progress we made. So we learned some lessons as a district of what works for students. We learned what works for teachers and how classrooms can be set up. And I think our math vision is still very strong in committing to developing every student as a mathematical thinker, to anchor things in rich tasks and rich problem solving, to give students ownership, identity, and agency around their math learning, and really focus in on that math identity piece. And so helping students become successful and see themselves in the math. And we know that to be successful in the pandemic really set us back. So what we're doing in the district now is doubling down on all of those ideas and theory, and increasing the dosage, increasing the involvement of adults, and focusing on mindsets. And so I think through expansion and partnerships, so we can get into all the schools. I mean, we have a lot of schools in the district, right? Over 400 elementary schools that we are needing this work in. And we're unique in that we're a K through 8. And so that gives us some advantages. Our teachers in our schools know our students really well. They've worked with these students for, upwards of 9 years, for those 8th graders that have been there from kindergarten or pre-K. And so leveraging those relationships and reforming that math identity for students is crucial as we work to address some of those lost skills and foundations that happened during the pandemic.
Yeah, and Corey, I wonder if I could just follow up. I mean, you talked about kind of working on mindset and self-concept so that students don't fall into the trap of thinking themselves as kind of not math people, maybe. They're not mathematical thinkers. Math is really tough for them. I know I fell into that subject, that trap myself as a student around the subject. I want to maybe ask you about another facet of that, though, Corey, and that is, I mean, you're working with a lot of adults now. A lot of teachers feel the same way. A lot of teachers are once students who struggled with math. Is it tough, and has it been tough over the last couple of years to build a sense of accomplishment in math, in young math teachers, and to help them keep students engaged around what is a very, very technically difficult subject to teach?
Yeah, it has been a challenge. I think it's been a challenge that central office and the CEO have identified and really invested in and put a lot of resources to support adult learners. And one of the bigger expansions in part of my career, granted I haven't been around that long, the central office, our math office, our STEM department has more humans available now to implement professional learning. Our professional learning offerings are more robust. We're able to do book studies with small groups. We're able to find niche groups of teachers around maybe algebra. We're able to offer learning around just unpacking standards. We're able to get into the nitty gritty of what it means to be quote unquote a math person. Well, if you ask me, if you ask anyone on my team, everybody's a math person. And it's all about tapping that potential and tapping into that identity. And so we have the resources now, which has been a great investment by the CEO and CEDO to set us up to be a little bit more impactful in classrooms. We have coaches, we have specialists. We've been working with the state to develop the K-5 math specialist, which is a certification similar to a reading specialist. I think that is a fantastic policy side of things that is giving folks the incentive and encouragement to go back to school possibly and get those coursework and get that confidence in the lower grades, because that's often where we find teachers have the least confidence in their math ability and their ability to let students productive struggle, because it looks really different to have a launch, explore, discuss model, this inquiry-based model in a K-5 space. You have to be very confident in your ability to anticipate students who might, quote unquote, go off the rails in their thinking. But that's the beauty of math instruction, is that when they go off the rails, they're following some set of axioms, they're following some set of logic or rules or things that maybe might not make sense or might have a misconception baked into it. But if you're confident as a teacher, then you're able to help that student navigate that journey around that learning to arrive at a really foundational, concrete understanding of the math. And so it might not be a direct shot. It might not be, we definitely don't want to encourage, having students just sit and receive information and try to mimic what their teachers are doing. We really want them to engage in it and explore it. But in order to do that, you have to have teachers have confidence. You have to have them with the skill set that they can identify and diagnose misconceptions and fundamental skills, and then provide differentiation and just-in-time supports in the moment, right? So being able to recognize it, analyze it, and then provide an instructional move that will meet that student where they are and in the shortest amount of time possible is what we're trying to get at. And the only way to do that is to invest in people and invest in professional development and really wrap our arms around educators to give them the support they need to make those real-time instructional moves to support students in a tier 1 space. It's not about the conversation is not about remediation, and it's not about pushing students to another space and saying they got to get their fundamental skills first before they can come back into the general instruction. It's all about how do you meet that need in the moment? How do you recognize it? How do you analyze it? And how do you provide some sort of differentiation in real time? And I think that's the primary objective with our tier 1 investments in a large district like Chicago Public, because it would be unsustainable to try and give every single student those kind of pull out or a separate space environment. We have to do it through the tier 1 classroom space. And I don't want to say that we aren't providing those things, because we are. We have a strong investment in tutoring. We partner with Saga, and we have high dosage tutoring throughout the district. But that was a long-standing practice before the pandemic. So we've been partnering with Saga since 2000. And AJ, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 2014? Or is it all 2014? So we know that high dosage tutoring is a component of working with students and getting them to where they need to be. But I think coming out of the pandemic, the heavy investment was in tier 1 teacher development and getting a high quality curriculum in front of every single student in the tier 1 space.
Spoilers, Corey, we're gonna deal a lot with Saga and Saga's work in Chicago in a couple of minutes. But thanks for that. That's a terrific comprehensive look at what you guys are doing with students and teachers. Tailheem, Wentt, how's it going? You are not only our student student participant, you're also the road warrior on this panel. You spent a couple months even before the pandemic out on the road with the aptly named Roadtrip Nation. And when you're doing that, you were talking to a bunch of really incredible, impressive professionals. We're talking about CEOs, folks in the political space, software engineers, about the struggles that they faced as students, especially coming out of underserved communities. I'm wondering, what were the common themes that you heard from these figures that we might think about when we think about re-engaging students who have stopped going to school, who are struggling to stay engaged when they're in school?
Okay, so 3 things. There weren't enough people like themselves that they saw themselves in those careers that they now have in those spaces. And it wasn't until they tried something different or put themselves in the space of people who were, let's say, software developers or let's say like IT security directors, for instance. Like once they started having more conversations and mentorship with them, it helped them shape their dreams. The second thing that they had was where they came from was completely and extremely underserved in different ways. You can only become like a mechanic, or you can only be like someone that works with sanitation, or whatever the community provided for them, instead of giving them a look at every career. And the third thing I would say was that they had the ideas and they had the want, but they didn't have the resources readily available at the time. Like they didn't have the internet, they didn't have YouTube. There weren't enough people that were using the internet or YouTube talking about these things. And it wasn't broadcasted to them as much. So even if there were these programs or, opportunities that you could take advantage of, they didn't know about them. So one of the things that they wanted to do was be a pioneer in their space and bring those opportunities to their communities. Something that really shocked me too was that I thought my story wasn't so common, but it's common, and a lot of times we just don't have enough conversations with people in different states and different parts of the world, honestly. Like when you see someone else that's going through the same thing that you're going through, it's easier to relate and motivate yourself and move forward. One of the things that we did have in common was that we both felt like we were working in a job that didn't have upwards movement to motivate us. So it definitely does play into your daily morale as a student. And it makes you go like, man, what's worth writing this essay? Like, why should I even waste my time writing this essay to get into this? No one really cares, or because you think your story is so unique, and then you find a whole bunch of other people that have done the same thing and achieved and came out of it, which is why Preschool was so attractive to me. And like I got to meet the CEO of Preschool and people that also went to Preschool and gained successful employment and gainful careers. And not only are they like supporting themselves, but they're supporting their families and their friends, and they're telling their friends to go to these programs. So I think it's more like, how do we highlight the success stories of people that have gone through it? And how do we also highlight what are some of the hardships of these programs? Like, for me personally, it was like going to in Preschool and hearing from them, they didn't have money while they were in the program, so it was hard for them to like eat. Or then Preschool started introducing like incentives and things like that while you go. So I think those things are very much helpful. And Tom, you spoke a lot to that earlier as well. And I think that was another theme that a lot of the leaders said, like, you want to incentivize these things because sometimes you just don't have those same resources at home.
Tailheem, sorry to jump in, but I want to riff on that just a little bit, because Preschool is for the benefit of our viewers at home, does incredible work helping students, especially those who might struggle in a conventional K-12 setting, maybe not, but a lot of them, to attain really important industry credentials and go on, as you say, to gainful careers. It's a great example, I think, of an organization outside of schools doing great work, continue to educate. I want to actually use that as a jumping off point to the work of Saga Education, which is bringing resources from outside of schools into schools. AJ, you've been at Saga since the beginning. It's one of the most successful tutoring programs in the country. I'm interested in asking, we're at a point where a lot of districts still have coffers full of COVID aid money, but that time and those dollars are running out. In the meantime, a lot of those districts have taken to high dosage tutoring in the way that Chicago did before the pandemic, because of the evidence that it's one of the most effective educational interventions that we've seen. However, the flip side of that is that it's really tough to scale historically. I'm wondering how you have seen the possibility of technology, and we're definitely going to talk a little bit about AI, help districts meet their demand for tutoring. I know that Saga has adopted they've explored the kind of the blended learning approach. Do you think there's a potential for integrating like some of the AI developments more recently into the work of tutoring? That's a lot of questions. Why don't you take them all? Okay.
Yeah, I object. That's a compound question, Your Honor. There's a lot of questions tied into one, but thank you for having me here, Kevin. I want to start off by saying, as a nonprofit organization, I think we really believe that collectively we have an obligation to provide the best quality education to our youth that's grounded in solid evidence. And so, what's amazing about the United States is the ingenuity we see in healthcare and in science, but that kind of innovation apparatus doesn't exist the same way in the education system. And so on the outset at Saga, we're thinking like, against the backdrop of inequities that have existed since the beginning of since the dawn of K-12 education, like, what is a great leap forward in starting to close these gaps? And time again, tutoring has proven to be a really great way to do it. The question is like, how do you do that in a sustainable and cost-effective way? And that's exactly what we have been exploring at Saga Education, even before, even before the existence of Saga. And as we play with different models and permutations using scientific evaluations to understand the impact on student outcomes. And so to date, our primary research partner has been the University of Chicago Education Lab. We've been part of 8 different randomized trials. And out of the scientific literature on high impact tutoring, the research on Saga is the largest. And we're one of the only organizations that actually has peer reviewed research. And I'm so proud and excited that the research basis on our work has been a central catalyst in the way in which the country is thinking about, COVID, recovery. We're at a really important inflection point in our history And the decisions we make right now is probably the most important decisions over the past 20 to 30 years in education, given the magnitude of the effect of COVID-19 on student learning. Ocer, calculated the economic impact of learning loss and estimates a $14.5 trillion long-term impact on the U.S. economy. Now, with that said, we now have a moral and economic imperative to find a way to mitigate against this. So going back to your question around tutoring, I think it starts with recognizing that not all tutoring is created equal. And there are key tenets and hallmarks that lead to success. And it all starts with this idea that, tutoring is not this after-school afterthought ad hoc idea. It's most effective when it's deeply connected to what's going on in school, right? Supporting the great work of our classroom teachers, having content that aligns with grade level standards, among other ideas. And so from a state leader perspective, I think what's really important is providing that guidance for district leaders and principals on like the hallmarks that lead to success. And going to your question on sustainability, I think there are three things that we have to think about when it comes to sustainability. So it's first, recognizing that you don't have to provide a tutor for every single student in every subject. I think we ought to identify the highest leverage points in the K-12 education continuum, which historically has been third grade literacy and ninth grade algebra 1. So if a student can read by third grade, they're 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. And similarly, you have this 4x effect in ninth grade algebra 1, right? If they're able to pass their algebra 1 class, they're 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. So from our perspective, like for districts in the country, we should focus on those things. In the United States, we have 9 million kids who are in grades 9 and 3. And if you provide a tutor, let's say for the third of students who would need it the most, let's say you had a model with a tutor had a caseload of 30 students, you would need 100,000 tutors to provide support to the 1/3 of students who would need it the most in this country at the highest leverage points. So there's a pathway for scale if we really want to do it from a national perspective. So as I think about scale, I think it's one, you don't need a tutor for every single student, like focus on the highest leverage points. And then the other piece is embracing, technology. At Saga, what we're really excited about is that the fact that we've highlighted an area worthy of additional exploration. And there's so many ways in which technologies can provide scalable solutions for districts to implement high impact tutoring. One of the things we've done is taken a step forward using blended learning technology. And the University of Chicago conducted a randomized trial of using a combination of adaptive learning technology coupled with the power of human tutoring. And what they discovered from this randomized trial that we were able to have the same kind of effect size and from a standard deviation perspective. But what's really compelling about that is that the blended learning model was 60% of the cost of our traditional high impact tutoring model. So for us, there are ways in which we can leverage these types of tools and technologies that allow us to not only be more cost sensitive, but also maintain fidelity and impact. The last thing I will say about sustainability in a world beyond Ocer, we believe the greatest pathway for sustainability is for empowering states and districts to implement high impact tutoring, on their own. So it's part of the fabric of how they approach human capital, scheduling and budgeting. You create the conditions where it can last long term, where you don't have to necessarily rely on a provider to do that. And so at Saga, we're trying to provide the tools and resources to empower our districts to be able to do this work effectively on their own. The last thing I will say about technology is we're also very excited about the potential of live online tutoring. Historically at Saga, we've provided support to some major cities like Chicago and New York cities of the world. But the question is like, how do you take evidence-based programs and make them applicable for like rural communities or suburban communities that have that kind of ecosystem of talent, when it comes to colleges and universities. And so we've been working alongside some of these state partners. For example, we have a partnership with the state of New Mexico supporting, I think this fall, likely support 30 to 35 districts. Their primary tool will be live online tutoring. And what we're going to do with the University of Chicago Education Lab is through a randomized trial, look at what impact this approach has on student outcomes. And so we're really excited about that new data coming across our table over the next year or so.
AJ, you talked a little about the technology, partly at my prodding, but I want to get to kind of the low-tech aspect of what tutoring accomplishes with kids. And specifically, your work and your career has been in part kind of a product of the relationships between students in the classroom and adult mentors, and most especially the educators at the front of the classroom. So in what is it about relationships between K-12 students and either teachers, tutors, other employees within a school that can help engage them and keep them engaged in school?
I think Corey said it really well. I mean, the gold standard would be to provide high levels of personalization for students. And even our nation's greatest teachers don't have time to consistently provide targeted instructional support. So there needs to be another mechanism in which we, support our classroom teachers and embed part of the K-12 experience, opportunities for kind of rigorous academic supports. And honestly, as we think about the innovations and excitement around language learning models, AI, from my perspective, technology, education is always going to be human-led. It's going to be equity-driven and technology augmented. And so for me, it's like thinking about how can you combine the best of the human capital and technology to kind of optimize how we engage youth and their families. I think it's when you're thinking about relationships, it's hard to, as such a quantitative person, like how do you quantify like the value of those types of connections? And I'm coming to you all today as someone not just as a co-founder of Saga, but someone who's personally experienced high impact tutoring. I'm think of the first generations of students in the United States who received the benefits of high impact tutoring. And it was game changing for me, to connect with someone who knew my name, who knew my birthday, who communicated with my mother, to help me understand what's going on in class. I mean, that to me was so profound, and it just kind of underscores that old age saying that kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And so when you feel connected to a caring adult in school, that's so important to increasing a sense of belonging in school. That I think it's always going to be really important as we think about engaging students in long term. The last thing I will say about this is that people are not just thinking about high impact tutoring in the context of COVID-19. There was a really great RAND report that was published recently. And no surprise to anyone, there's so much more we can do as a country to better support STEM education. And when RAND reached out to principals and teachers nationwide to ask, like, what are some of the tools and strategies we can use to improve STEM learning, the number one recommendation from principals and teachers was high impact tutoring. I say this because people are not just thinking about this as a strategy in the context of COVID, but they're now thinking about in a way in which we can think differently about educational delivery in the long term. So it's really important for us to kind of set those right standards, resources, and support so that this type of approach can be implemented with high fidelity in the long term as well.
I want to get back to you with a question about something that I asked a couple of minutes ago. We're hearing a lot about the fiscal cliff that districts and states are facing in 2025, where this influx of federal COVID aid is going to start diminishing. I'm asking you, Tom, what advice do you have for districts about how they can change and adapt their operational models to address that impending fiscal challenge? And it's only going to mount with the coming years, it seems.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, the context is important, and that is that the stakes are really quite high. And we've seen a lot of districts and even state departments of education lowering standards for students in the wake of the pandemic, notwithstanding the good work that Corey and colleagues are doing in Chicago and AJ's doing in the name of high quality tutoring. But there is a broad sense that kids have really suffered and that we shouldn't expect too much of them. And from our point of view, that's really problematic. because the notion that kids will catch up is sort of directly contrary to the notion that we're going to lower standards along the way to help do that, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, I'm not sure that the fiscal cliff may be the challenging a barrier as some commentators have suggested. A lot of the COVID money and together in 3 tranches of federal funding, it adds up to about $189 billion, which is a big number for sure. But a lot of that money has been spent on upgrading facilities, HVAC systems, and other things that frankly are relevant to learning opportunities and student success. There are those who say that those things are not money's well spent, but we don't fully agree on that. And then a lot of the hires have been short-term hires too, among other things, bring in outside community members to help connect with students, as we've been talking about. And I can't reinforce strongly enough the point that everybody on the webinar has been suggesting, and that is that essentially kids care when they feel cared about. To rephrase AJ's framing on that. So we really do need to build bridges. And so I would pull back a little bit from the doomsday language on the fiscal cliff. It will be real in some cases. And the good news is that there are other sources of money, federal Title I monies, federal Title II monies under the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the principal federal K-12 legislation, all provide pots of money that can be tapped into. And I do think, and I'm sure AJ is working closely with districts on this, I do think that there can be creative ways to both spend money differently to focus it on tutoring and other high return investments, and also to lower the cost of those types of services. He's absolutely right in suggesting a combined model that includes personal contact, adult-student relationships on the one hand, with technology on the other, can lower costs dramatically.
So, go ahead, AJ.
Important. I think, at this moment, especially in a world beyond Ocer, I think we should really encourage our district leaders and state leaders to kind of shake up the status quo and really think about, like, are we using our funding in the most optimal way? And looking at the scientific literature, like, what are other ways in which we can use our limited resources that give us our most bang for our buck? And so I think right now is the moment to start to do that. High impact tutoring is part of the portfolio of things I think we ought to do to support kids. Like, high impact tutoring is not a silver bullet to addressing the challenges students are experiencing right now. So I think that also requires us to conduct additional evaluations and research and investing in district leaders' data capacity so that they can provide information and to researchers and evaluators. So I also think that's important in the context of how we're thinking about how do we continue programs after Ocer dollars. And the last thing I will say is although high impact tutoring is expensive, according to University of Chicago, when implemented well, high impact tutoring could almost triple the amount of math learning than in comparison to the control group. And they calculated the return on investment based on the standard deviation gains, academic gains per student, and estimate a return of $6 for every dollar invested in high impact tutoring. So this makes this approach among the most cost-effective approaches ever rigorously evaluated in U.S. public education. So I think it's worth the investment. Although we should continue to find ways to make this approach more affordable, it's extremely cost-effective way to engage youth. And so, if I to be provocative here to a district leader, like, what's the opportunity cost for you for investing in this? Like, what is the other thing that you're going to put money towards that could lead to a greater kind of academic outcome for students? That, and if that thing exists, I would love to see it. But to be provocative, I think I'm just saying this to make a point, which is I think we should really start leaning into what kind of the scientific literature is saying, kind of versus kind of some of these trends legacy programs we've continued to support over the last 20-30 years.
Well put, AJ. Maybe, Tailheem, we can close on you and your personal experience. Looking ahead, think about schools, think about institutions beyond K-12 schools, maybe on the employment side. What do you think needs to happen? What do you think people in leadership need to be doing to kind of break down the barriers between education and employment opportunities? It feels like, especially for older students, this is where a lot of students get disconnected. But if we could foster a link or bridge the school and employment opportunities, we could be setting a lot more kids up for success. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I honestly feel like one of the best things is crowdsourcing students' opinions on things that they think are cool careers, and then going to community leaders in those sectors and industries and trying to, like, for instance, there's different types of math that applies to different careers. Like you use, like, I guess, trig when you're doing something different. I can't give you the exact name of it, but like focus this. Yeah.
No worries. I think I know what he's going for with this career thing. So I'm very supportive of use it, say how you would say it, speak about how it applies. You don't have to have all the right language for it, but we understand.
Yeah, like align it more closely to what you would do in the day-to-day career. For me, everything that I learned, I went to college for graphic design, but now I'm an IT manager. So it's like some of the things applied, but the thing that kept me in IT is the fact that I like to make beats and love music. That's what made me pick up and go, oh man, I can do Preschool, because every day after school, I'm picking up computer parts because I didn't have the resources to buy a new computer to keep up with the new applications that were being released for me to make beats. So I went on YouTube and I was like, oh, if I can teach myself on YouTube, I can listen to instruction that is virtual. So it's like, find education, like make it easier for us to find things that apply for us. And then we'll explore from there. It'll go very quickly. Like, I was doing security and now I literally work for one of the companies I used to hold the door for. So I'm very grateful. I think about it. It's like, and I go to myself like, man, I put so much stress and pressure on myself to achieve in college and go this one set path. And instead of just pursuing something that I loved, and I did that and I haven't stopped. It's just been an upwards progression. So I think that's something that's really important for students, is like pushing what they love more so as a set group of stuff. Here, let me throw all of these topics at you, and then you might like one, instead of naturally, like you're all saying, like paying attention to what the student likes. Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to thank all of my guests, Tom, Tailheem, Corey, AJ, for what has been a very stimulating panel. I'm grateful to all of you, and thank you all of you for listening out in the wider world. We appreciate your attention. So that's it for us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.